Imagine standing in the freezing mud of the Elbe River Valley in the pitch black of early morning. It is April 16th, 1945. You are looking west toward a city that has been the nerve center of a global nightmare for 12 years. In front of you, hidden in the darkness, are over 2.5 million hardened Soviet soldiers, supported by 41,000 artillery pieces and mortars. That is not a typo or an exaggeration. The Red Army has massed an artillery piece every 13 feet along the breakthrough sectors. If you were to fire them all at once, the sheer atmospheric overpressure would rupture the eardrums of anyone standing within a mile. This is the precipice of the Battle of Berlin, the largest, bloodiest, and most apocalyptic urban clash in human history. To understand how we arrived at this moment of absolute annihilation, we have to strip away the Hollywood myths and look at the cold, hard logistics, the ruthless doctrines, and the sheer industrial weight that brought the Soviet juggernaut to Hitler's doorstep. If you want to dive deep into the tactical realities of military history, dissecting the strategies, the armor, and the firepower that shaped our world, you are in the right place. Make sure to hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join our community of armchair generals and history veterans as we break down the art of war. Now, let us look at the strategic chessboard of Europe in the spring of 1945. By April, the Third Reich was a hollowed-out shell, compressed from the west by the Americans, the British, and the French, and from the east by an unyielding Soviet steamroller. A common question still debated in war colleges today is why the Western Allies did not race the Soviets to Berlin. Why did General Dwight D. Eisenhower halt the American advance at the Elbe River, roughly 60 miles west of the German capital? The answer comes down to a brutal calculus of blood and post-war politics. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, the Allied leaders had already drawn the lines on the map. Berlin was to be deep inside the Soviet occupation zone. Eisenhower, looking at the intelligence, knew that taking a heavily fortified urban center like Berlin would cost the United States anywhere from 100,000 to 200,000 casualties. Would you sacrifice an entire American field army for a city you had already agreed to hand over to Stalin the moment the shooting stopped? Eisenhower was a pragmatist, not a glory hound. He chose to pivot his forces south to secure the rumored Alpine fortress in Bavaria, leaving the ultimate meat grinder to the Red Army. But Stalin had his own paranoid motivations for wanting Berlin, and he wanted it fast. It was not just about planting the red flag on the Reichstag for propaganda. It was about securing the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute and Germany's nuclear research. The Cold War had already begun in the minds of the Soviet leadership, and Stalin knew the Americans were close to building the atomic bomb. He needed the German scientists, the uranium ore, and the research data before Western intelligence agencies could snatch them up. To ensure maximum speed, Stalin played a ruthless psychological game with his top two commanders, Marshal Georgy Zhukov commanding the 1st Belarusian Front and Marshal Ivan Konev commanding the 1st Ukrainian Front. Stalin essentially drew a boundary line between their two massive army groups but stopped the line about 40 miles short of Berlin. He looked at both men and told them whoever broke through the German defenses first would have the honor of taking the capital. It was a twisted, high-stakes version of Patton and Montgomery's race to Messina in Sicily, but instead of a friendly rivalry, this was driven by absolute fear of the dictator and a disregard for human life. Let us break down the sheer, terrifying scale of the Soviet force structure waiting on the Oder and Neisse rivers. We are talking about a combined force of 2.5 million men. To put that into perspective, that is roughly equivalent to the entire population of Chicago mobilized for a single battle. They brought with them over 6,200 tanks and self-propelled guns, and 7,500 aircraft. The logistical tale required to feed this beast is almost incomprehensible. The Red Army had to convert the European standard gauge railways back through Poland to the wider Russian broad gauge just to keep the supply trains running. They stockpiled over 7 million artillery shells for the opening phase alone. And how did they move this mountain of ammunition from the railheads to the front lines? American steel. Through the Lend-Lease program, the United States had supplied the Soviet Union with over 400,000 trucks, primarily the legendary Studebaker US-6. These 2.5-ton trucks were the unsung heroes of the Eastern Front, giving the Red Army a level of motorized mobility that the horse-drawn German Wehrmacht could only dream of. The Soviet military doctrine at this stage was the culmination of 4 years of brutal trial and error. It was called deep battle, or Glubokaya Operatia. Unlike the German Blitzkrieg, which relied on a single, decisive armored spearhead to cause psychological collapse, deep battle was about simultaneous, successive operations across a massive front. It was designed to rupture the enemy line, pour heavily armored shock armies through the gap, and strike deep into the enemy's operational depth, destroying their reserves and logistics before they could even react. The tip of this spear was the Soviet armored force, completely transformed from the early days of the war. They were no longer relying on the early models of the T-34 with their two-man turrets and lack of radios. By 1945, the standard medium tank was the T-34-85, upgraded with a larger three-man turret and an 85mm gun capable of threatening German heavy armor. But the real apex predators of the Soviet armored formations were the IS-2 heavy tanks. The IS-2, named after Iosif Stalin, was a 46-ton monster designed specifically to crack German defensive lines and slaughter tigers and panthers. It mounted a massive 122mm D-25T rifled gun. To understand the sheer kinetic energy of this weapon, you have to look at the ballistics. While the American 76mm gun on the late-war Shermans relied on high velocity to punch through armor, the Soviet 122mm gun fired a massive 55-pound high-explosive shell. Even if it did not penetrate the armor of a German Tiger tank, the sheer concussive force of a direct hit was enough to crack the armor plate, spall the interior, and turn the crew into jelly through sheer shockwave overpressure. However, the IS-2 had a critical flaw that would become glaringly apparent in the tight streets of Berlin. It used two-piece ammunition, meaning the loader had to ram the heavy projectile in first, followed by the powder charge. This resulted in a dismal rate of fire of barely 2 to 3 rounds per minute. In an urban knife fight where whoever shoots second dies, that slow reload time was a fatal liability. On the other side of the Oder River, situation for the German defenders was a study in absolute catastrophic desperation. Facing the 2.5 million Soviets was Army Group Vistula, commanded by General Oberst Gotthard Heinrici. Heinrici was not a Nazi fanatic. He was an old-school Prussian officer, a veteran of the First World War, and widely considered the best defensive tactician in the German army. Heinrici had a reputation for saving his men by conducting brilliant fighting withdrawals, a skill that infuriated Hitler. Heinrici was given roughly 766,000 men to hold the line, but looking at that number on paper is highly deceptive. This was not the Wehrmacht of 1941. The veteran divisions had been ground to dust in places like Stalingrad, Kursk, and Operation Bagration. What Heinrici had left was a hodgepodge of shattered regular army units, Waffen-SS foreign volunteers who knew they would be executed if captured, and the Volkssturm. The Volkssturm, or People's Storm, was a national militia created in the final months of the war, conscripting any male between the ages of 16 and 60 who was not already in uniform. Do you really think a 60-year-old baker with a bad heart, handed a captured Italian rifle and 5 rounds of ammunition, is going to stop a 46-ton Soviet heavy tank? Of course not, but that was the operational reality of the Third Reich in its final days. Alongside them were the children of the Hitler Youth, boys as young as 12 or 13, brainwashed by a decade of state propaganda into believing they could turn the tide of the war. The German industrial heartland in the Ruhr Valley had been bombed back to the Stone Age by American and British heavy bombers. Factories were operating in caves and underground bunkers. Because they could no longer produce enough artillery, tanks, or aircraft, the German defense relied heavily on a cheap, mass-produced weapon that would become the defining tool of the urban battle to come, the Panzerfaust. The Panzerfaust was a single-use, recoilless anti-tank weapon. It was essentially a metal tube with a black powder propellant charge and a massive warhead on the end. It utilized a shaped charge, meaning the explosive force was focused into a concentrated point, turning a copper cone inside the warhead into a superheated jet of molten metal traveling at hypersonic speeds. It could punch through 8 inches of solid steel armor. It was cheap, it required almost no training to use, and in the ruins of a destroyed city, it was the ultimate equalizer. A 12-year-old boy hiding in a basement window could wait for a Soviet T-34 to roll past, pop up, fire a Panzerfaust into the thin side armor, and destroy a tank that took thousands of man-hours to build. The Soviets were acutely aware of this threat. If you look at photos of Soviet tanks from the Battle of Berlin, you will see them covered in what looks like bed frames and wire mesh. This was improvised spaced armor designed to detonate the Panzerfaust warhead early, dissipating the molten jet before it hit the main armor plate. It was a brutal adaptation to a deadly new reality. Heinrici knew he could not stop the Soviets at the river. The math simply did not work. He had barely 1,500 tanks and assault guns, and his air support from the Luftwaffe was virtually non-existent, crippled by a lack of aviation fuel. So Heinrici looked at the terrain. Between the Oder River and Berlin lay the Seelow Heights, a ridge rising about 150 feet above the Oderbruch floodplain. In military terms, high ground is everything. It offers observation, fields of fire, and forces the attacker to move uphill, slowing their momentum. The Oderbruch itself was a nightmare for mechanized forces. It was spring, the ground was thawing, and the Germans had intentionally opened the dams upriver, turning the floodplain into a muddy, impassable swamp. Heinrici turned the Seelow Heights into a fortress. He dug 3 distinct defensive belts, heavily mined the approaches, and sighted his dreaded 88mm anti-aircraft guns for direct fire against ground targets. The 88 was originally designed to shoot down high-flying bombers, but its high muzzle velocity and flat trajectory made it the most lethal anti-tank gun of the war. But Heinrici's true genius lay in his understanding of Soviet doctrine. He knew that Marshal Zhukov relied on massive, overwhelming artillery bombardments to obliterate the front line before sending his infantry forward. It was a tactic straight out of the First World War, reminiscent of the brutal frontal assaults at Cold Harbor during the American Civil War, but scaled up to an industrial extreme. Heinrici had used a specific counter-tactic before, and he planned to use it again. He ordered his frontline troops to maintain only a skeleton crew in the forward trenches. The night before he anticipated the Soviet attack, he planned to secretly pull the bulk of his combat forces back to the second line of defense on the heights. When the Soviet artillery unleashed its hellish barrage, it would fall on empty trenches, wasting millions of shells on dirt and mud. Then, when the Soviet infantry charged forward, expecting to find the Germans annihilated, they would run headlong into a fully intact, heavily fortified defensive wall. Zhukov, however, was supremely confident. He had concentrated the bulk of his forces in a massive bridgehead on the western bank of the Oder, near the town of Kustrin. He wanted to shatter the Seelow Heights with a single overwhelming blow, drive straight down the highway, and take Berlin in a matter of days. To achieve total tactical surprise and blind the German defenders, Zhukov came up with a highly unconventional plan. He ordered the deployment of 143 massive anti-aircraft searchlights, spaced every 200 yards along the front line. The idea was to turn them on at the exact moment the infantry assault began, illuminating the battlefield, blinding the German gunners, and casting terrifying shadows to disorient the enemy. It was a theatrical, almost cinematic concept, but in the gritty reality of mechanized warfare, clever ideas often fall victim to the friction of the battlefield. As the clock ticked past 3 in the morning on April 16th, the tension in the Soviet trenches was palpable. Millions of men checked their PP-41 submachine guns, a weapon perfectly suited for the close-quarters trench clearing to come with its 71-round drum magazine. Tank commanders idled the massive diesel engines of their T-34s, the exhaust fumes mixing with the freezing ground fog. In the rear echelons, thousands of artillerymen stood by their guns, lanyards in hand, waiting for the signal. The sheer logistical weight of the Soviet Empire had been brought to bear on this single point on the map. The industrial might of the Ural Mountains, untouched by German bombers, had produced an unstoppable wave of steel and flesh. Across the muddy expanse of the Oderbruch, Heinrici's men sat in their secondary positions, shivering in the cold, clutching their Panzerfausts and Mauser rifles, knowing that they were the last barrier between the Red Army and the heart of Germany. At exactly 4 in the morning, local time, the sky behind the Soviet lines erupted in a continuous blinding sheet of flame. The roar was not a series of explosions, but a single, deafening, sustained thunderclap that physically shook the earth for miles around. 40,000 guns, mortars, and Katyusha rocket launchers fired simultaneously. The Katyushas, nicknamed Stalin's organs for their howling shriek, rained high-explosive rockets down in devastating grid squares. For 30 minutes, the greatest artillery barrage in the history of human conflict pounded the German forward positions. Millions of pounds of high explosives turned the first line of trenches into a lunar landscape of craters and pulverized earth. Zhukov watched from his command post, convinced that nothing could possibly survive that level of kinetic devastation. As the barrage lifted, he gave the order. The 143 searchlights snapped on, piercing the darkness with blinding beams of light, and the Soviet infantry surged forward into the muddy abyss. But as the lead elements of the Red Army struggled through the swampy ground and the thick smoke of their own bombardment, they were about to discover that Heinrich's trap had worked perfectly, and the bloodiest battle of the war was only just beginning. The blinding beams of 143 anti-aircraft searchlights pierced the pre-dawn darkness, but instead of illuminating the terrified German defenders, they hit a solid, impenetrable wall of smoke, dust, and pulverized earth kicked up by the massive Soviet artillery barrage. Physics is a harsh and unforgiving mistress on the battlefield. The intense light reflected off the particulate matter in the air, creating a phenomenon known as backscatter. The Soviet infantry and armor, surging forward into the muddy expanse of the Oderbruch floodplain, were perfectly silhouetted against this glowing, impenetrable fog. They were completely blind, while the German gunners sitting high up on the Seelow heights could see their targets outlined as clearly as targets in a shooting gallery. The trap General Gotthard Heinrici had set was now springing shut with terrifying efficiency. As the Soviet T-34-85 and IS-2 tanks rolled into the floodplain, they immediately encountered the nightmarish reality of the terrain. The Germans had opened the dams upriver, turning the valley into a freezing, waterlogged sponge. Even with the famously wide tracks of the T-34, designed specifically to lower ground pressure and navigate the infamous Russian mud, the sheer depth of the mire was too much. Tanks bogged down to their hulls, their engines screaming and throwing thick, black diesel smoke into the air as they desperately tried to gain traction. This is where the tactical superiority of the German defensive position became a slaughter. Sighted imperfectly from the elevated ridge were hundreds of 88mm anti-aircraft guns, repurposed for direct anti-tank fire. To understand the lethality of the German 88, you have to look at its ballistics. The Flak 36 fired a 20-pound armor-piercing, ballistic-capped projectile at a staggering muzzle velocity of 2,690 feet per second. Its trajectory was incredibly flat, meaning the gunner rarely had to calculate complex drop algorithms at standard combat ranges. When that shell struck the sloped frontal armor of a T-34, it did not just penetrate, it shattered the interior, turning the crew compartment into a blender of spalling red-hot steel and explosive force. Within the first hour of the assault, the muddy valley floor was littered with hundreds of burning Soviet tanks. The infantry, slogging through waist-deep freezing water and mud, were pinned down by sweeping fields of MG-42 machine gun fire. The MG-42, known as Hitler's buzzsaw, fired at a cyclic rate of 1,200 rounds per minute, a sound that American GIs in Normandy had compared to ripping canvas. Here at Seelow, it was cutting down Soviet shock troops by the battalion. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, commanding the 1st Belarusian front from his bunker, was receiving frantic radio reports that his unstoppable juggernaut was bleeding out in the mud. The frontal assault against entrenched heights was eerily reminiscent of Union General Ambrose Burnside's disastrous attacks at Fredericksburg during the American Civil War, where wave after wave of federal troops were fed into a meat grinder against Marye's Heights. But at Seelow, the carnage was scaled up to an industrial extreme. How do you untangle a stalled offensive involving millions of men when the dictator in Moscow is breathing down your neck? If you are Zhukov, you double down on brute force. Panicking that his rival to the south, Marshal Ivan Konev, might beat him to Berlin, Zhukov made a highly controversial tactical decision. He ordered his heavily armored reserves, the 1st and 2nd Guards tank armies, to immediately enter the battle. This was a direct violation of Soviet deep battle doctrine, which dictated that armored reserves should only be committed after the infantry had punched a clean hole through the enemy lines. By throwing thousands of fresh tanks into the already congested and muddy bridgehead, Zhukov created a traffic jam of apocalyptic proportions. Imagine Interstate 95 during a hurricane evacuation, but replace the minivans with 40-ton armored vehicles, and add thousands of incoming high-explosive artillery shells raining down on the gridlock. Tanks could not maneuver, supply trucks could not move forward, and ambulances could not evacuate the wounded. It was a logistical nightmare that cost the Red Army thousands of unnecessary casualties. Meanwhile, just to the south, Marshal Konev was executing a masterclass in river crossing operations. Facing the Nesa River, Konev knew he could not rely on brute force alone to breach the German lines. Instead, he utilized one of the largest and most effective smokescreens in military history. Under the cover of a dense, artificially generated fog that stretched for nearly 150 miles, Soviet combat engineers threw pontoon bridges across the river in record time. It was a mechanized, heavily armed version of George Washington crossing the Delaware, achieving total tactical surprise. Konev's armored spearheads shattered the 4th Panzer Army and began racing across the open German countryside. Stalin, sitting in the Kremlin, monitored the progress of both fronts. In a move of pure psychological manipulation, Stalin picked up the phone, called Zhukov, and casually mentioned that Konev was making excellent progress and might be ordered to turn north to take Berlin instead. That phone call was all it took to drive Zhukov into a state of absolute ruthless frenzy. He ordered his commanders at Seelow to take the heights regardless of the cost in human life. For 3 days, the Seelow Heights became a vortex of violence. Soviet infantry resorted to human wave attacks, climbing over the bodies of their fallen comrades to reach the German trenches. It was close-quarters butchery, with entrenching tools, bayonets, and bare hands. Finally, by April 19th, the sheer mathematical weight of the Red Army broke the back of the German defenders. Heinrich's Army Group Vistula shattered into disconnected fragments. The Ninth Army, commanded by General Theodor Buss, was cut off and surrounded in a massive pocket of pine forests near the town of Halbe, southeast of Berlin. Inside the Halbe pocket were roughly 80,000 German soldiers, mixed with tens of thousands of terrified civilian refugees fleeing the Soviet advance. What followed was one of the most harrowing and desperate breakout attempts of the entire war. The German Ninth Army had to fight its way westward through dense woods, hoping to link up with the American lines at the Elbe River. The Soviets, fully aware of the encirclement, simply parked their artillery and Katyusha rocket launchers around the perimeter and pounded the forest into splinters. The trees themselves became lethal weapons, as high-explosive shells detonating in the canopy sent razor-sharp wooden shrapnel raining down on the exposed columns. It was a chaotic, moving slaughterhouse. German Tiger and Panther tanks out of fuel were abandoned or blown up by their own crews. Soldiers and civilians alike were crushed by Soviet tank treads or cut down by crossfire in the dark. Only a fraction of the Ninth Army managed to break out, leaving behind a forest floor carpeted with tens of thousands of corpses that are still being discovered by logging crews today. With the Ninth Army annihilated and the Seelow Heights secured, the road to Berlin was finally wide open. By April 20th, which happened to be Adolf Hitler's 56th birthday, the lead elements of the Soviet artillery moved into range of the city center. As Hitler distributed iron crosses to child soldiers of the Hitler Youth in the garden of the Reich Chancellery, the first Soviet shells began crashing into the streets of the capital. This marked a fundamental shift in the nature of the battle. The sweeping armored maneuvers of the open countryside were over. The Red Army was now entering an urban jungle of concrete, steel, and rubble, an environment that would completely neutralize their numerical superiority and favor the desperate defenders. To adapt to this brutal new reality, Soviet commanders radically reorganized their forces into specialized assault groups, known as Shigrovi. An urban assault group was a self-contained instrument of destruction, typically consisting of 10 to 12 infantrymen, armed entirely with submachine guns and grenades. They were accompanied by a combat engineer carrying satchel charges to blow through walls, a flamethrower operator to clear basements, and most importantly, direct-fire heavy artillery. The undisputed king of the street fighting in Berlin was the Soviet ISU-152, a massive self-propelled gun affectionately nicknamed the Zveroboy, or Beast Killer. The ISU-152 was essentially a heavily armored box mounted on a heavy tank chassis, carrying a monstrous 152mm howitzer. In the open field, it was designed to destroy heavy German armor. But in the tight streets of Berlin, it was used as a master key to unlock stubborn defensive positions. When a Soviet assault group took sniper fire from a multi-story apartment building, they did not waste time trying to clear it room by room like modern SWAT teams. That is a quick way to lose an entire squad. Instead, they would radio the ISU-152 waiting at the end of the block. The massive machine would roll forward, level its gun at the building, and fire a 96-pound high-explosive fragmentation shell directly through the front door. The resulting detonation inside the enclosed space of the building would create a massive overpressure shockwave, instantly killing anyone inside, collapsing the load-bearing walls, and bringing the entire structure down in a pile of smoking bricks. It was a brutal, indiscriminate, but highly effective method of urban renewal. But even with these heavy weapons, the Soviets were about to face defensive structures unlike anything they had encountered in the war. As the Red Army pushed deeper into the city suburbs, they ran into the German flak towers. These were not just anti-aircraft positions. They were monolithic, above-ground concrete fortresses designed by Hitler's chief architect, Albert Speer. The most famous was the Zoo Tower, located in the Tiergarten. It was a massive concrete cube over 130 feet tall, with walls up to 10 feet thick, reinforced with steel rebar. It had its own independent water supply, hospital, and power generator. Mounted on the roof were 4 twin 128mm anti-aircraft guns, radar-guided and capable of firing 45-pound explosive shells. As the Soviet ground forces approached, the German gunners simply depressed the massive barrels of these weapons and fired directly into the streets below. What do you do when a concrete fortress shrugs off your heaviest siege guns like rain? The Soviet 152mm shells simply bounced off the 10-foot thick walls of the Zoo Tower, leaving nothing but scorch marks. The flak towers were essentially impervious to anything short of a direct hit from a heavy bomber, and the Soviets did not have the time to coordinate strategic airstrikes. The only option was to bypass them, leaving these concrete islands of resistance in the rear, and force the infantry to bleed for every inch of ground around them. The battle was devolving into a three-dimensional nightmare. Combat was happening in the sewers, in the subway tunnels, on the ground floors, and across the rooftops simultaneously. The Soviet rings were tightening, squeezing the remaining defenders into a shrinking perimeter in the government district. The air was thick with the smell of cordite, pulverized brick, and rotting flesh, and the final, apocalyptic showdown for the Reichstag and the Führer bunker was only blocks away. The final, apocalyptic showdown for the Reichstag and the Führer bunker was not a battle of sweeping maneuvers, but a claustrophobic, three-dimensional meat grinder. By April 28, the Soviet Third Shock Army had fought its way to the banks of the Spree River, less than a mile from the absolute center of Nazi power. The primary obstacle standing between the Red Army and the Reichstag was the Moltke Bridge. The Germans had heavily rigged the bridge with explosives, intending to drop it into the river to halt the Soviet armor. But in the chaotic inferno of the city, the explosive charges had been damaged by random artillery shrapnel, and when the plunger was pushed, only a partial detonation occurred. The bridge sagged, but it held. Soviet infantry, supported by the massive ISU-152 assault guns we discussed earlier, immediately rushed the span under a withering crossfire of machine guns and Panzerfausts. The carnage on the bridge was absolute, with destroyed Soviet tanks acting as steel barricades for the infantry trying to crawl across the twisted metal. Why would Marshal Zhukov sacrifice thousands of his most elite shock troops for a burned-out husk of a building that had not housed a functioning parliament in 12 years? The Reichstag had been gutted by a fire in 1933 and was tactically insignificant compared to the heavily fortified flak towers or the Reich Chancellery. The answer lies entirely in the brutal political theater dictated by Joseph Stalin. May 1st was International Workers' Day, the holiest holiday in the Soviet calendar. Stalin had mandated that the red flag must fly over the symbol of German fascism by that exact date, regardless of the human cost. This political deadline forced Soviet commanders to abandon methodical urban clearing tactics and launch reckless, head-on assaults against heavily fortified positions. Defending the Reichstag and the surrounding diplomatic quarter was not the regular German army, but a fanatical rearguard composed largely of foreign volunteers. The defense of the government district was anchored by the remnants of the 11th SS Volunteer Panzergrenadier Division Nordland, made up mostly of Scandinavians, and the 33rd Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS Charlemagne, comprised entirely of French collaborators. These men fought with a terrifying suicidal intensity. They knew they could never go home. If they surrendered to the Soviets, they would be executed, and if they somehow escaped back to France or Norway, they would be tried for treason and hanged. They had literally nothing to lose. The French SS troops were particularly lethal with Panzerfausts, stalking Soviet T-34s through the rubble of the diplomatic quarter like big game hunters. When the Soviet infantry finally breached the massive, neo-Renaissance doors of the Reichstag on April 30th, they entered a pitch-black nightmare. The Germans had bricked up all the windows to create firing slits, meaning the interior was plunged into total darkness, filled with the choking smoke of burning debris and cordite. The battle inside the Reichstag devolved into medieval savagery. Soldiers fought room by room, hallway by hallway, using the flashes of their own submachine guns to illuminate their targets. When the ammunition ran dry, it came down to sharpened entrenching tools, combat knives, and bare hands. Tracers ricocheted off the marble columns, and grenades were dropped down elevator shafts. It took the Soviets 2 full days of point-blank slaughter just to clear the building. While this very public spectacle of violence was consuming the Reichstag, the true nerve center of the German war machine was collapsing in silence 50 feet below the ground. Inside the Führer bunker, Adolf Hitler was living out his final hours in a state of complete physical and psychological deterioration. The ventilation system of the bunker continuously sucked in the smell of pulverized concrete and rotting flesh from the streets above, a constant reminder of the apocalypse happening on the surface. Hitler had spent the last week moving non-existent armies on his map, placing his hopes on a phantom counterattack by SS General Felix Steiner, an attack that was mathematically impossible, given that Steiner's forces were practically annihilated. By April 30th, the reality of the situation could no longer be denied. Soviet assault groups were less than 500 yards away. Determined not to suffer the same fate as the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, who had been executed and hung upside down at a gas station in Milan just days prior, Hitler made his final strategic decision. At roughly 3:30 in the afternoon, Hitler and his new wife, Eva Braun, retreated to his private study. He bit into a glass cyanide capsule and simultaneously fired a 7.65mm Walther PPK semi-automatic pistol into his right temple. The logistics of disposing of a dictator in a besieged city are surprisingly complex. Hitler had left strict orders that his body must be completely destroyed to prevent it from becoming a Soviet trophy. His SS adjutants carried the corpses up the stairs to the Chancellery Garden, which was currently being churned into mud by Soviet artillery shells. They had managed to siphon roughly 200 liters of aviation fuel from the tanks of destroyed vehicles in the underground garage. They poured the fuel over the bodies and threw a lit piece of paper into the trench. It takes a tremendous amount of sustained thermal energy to completely incinerate a human body, and an open-air gasoline fire is highly inefficient. The bodies were severely charred but not completely destroyed, leaving enough dental evidence for Soviet counterintelligence units, known as SMERSH, to later identify the remains. How does a modern military force process the sheer tactical and strategic lessons learned from the annihilation of Berlin? The primary tactical lesson was the absolute vulnerability of unsupported armor in an urban environment. The Soviet tank armies had bled profusely in the narrow streets, falling victim to a three-dimensional battle space where threats came from the sewers below and the rooftops above. This brutal reality is a recurring nightmare in military history. We can draw a direct comparison to the United States military's experience during the Battle of Manila in 1945. General Douglas MacArthur's forces had to systematically destroy the Philippine capital with 155mm artillery to dig out the entrenched Japanese defenders, resulting in catastrophic civilian casualties and the total leveling of the city. Urban combat always strips away the advantages of maneuver and technology, reducing war to a bloody arithmetic of high explosives and infantry attrition. Furthermore, we can look at the United States Marine Corps' experience during the Battle of Hue City in the 1968 Tet Offensive. The Marines quickly learned that moving through the streets or entering through doors was a death sentence, leading to the adoption of mouse-holing, the tactic of using C4 explosives or rocket launchers to blow holes through adjacent interior walls to move from building to building. The Red Army had pioneered this exact technique in Stalingrad and perfected it in Berlin, using their combat engineers with satchel charges to bypass the lethal kill zones of the open streets. The geometry of urban warfare does not change. It only demands more blood from those who fail to respect its rules. From a strategic and logistical perspective, the fall of Berlin represents the ultimate manifestation of total war. The logistical tale required to sustain the Soviet offensive was staggering. The Red Army was firing thousands of tons of ammunition every single day. To feed an army of 2.5 million men in a city where the infrastructure had completely ceased to exist required the total cannibalization of the surrounding countryside. This total destruction of the enemy's economic and physical capacity to wage war mirrors General William Tecumseh Sherman's infamous March to the Sea during the American Civil War in 1864. Sherman understood that to defeat the Confederacy, he had to destroy its railroads, its factories, and its agricultural base, breaking the psychological will of the civilian population. The Soviet destruction of Berlin was Sherman's doctrine scaled up to the industrial age, leaving the capital of the Third Reich as nothing more than a field of smoking rubble, an era the Germans would grimly refer to as Stunde Null, or 0 hour. But as the artillery pounded the last pockets of resistance, a completely different, highly classified war was already being fought in the shadows. Did the Second World War actually end in Berlin, or did it merely mutate into a 45-year global standoff? The answer lies in the actions of the intelligence operatives moving right behind the frontline troops. While the infantry was bleeding for the Reichstag, specialized units of the Soviet NKVD were ignoring the firefights and racing toward the Dahlem district in the southwest of the city. Their target was the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physics. Stalin knew that the Americans were close to completing the atomic bomb. The Soviet nuclear program was desperate for raw materials and data. These Soviet intelligence teams, part of the Russian Alsos project, successfully captured German nuclear scientists, laboratory equipment, and most importantly, hundreds of tons of refined uranium oxide that the Germans had not managed to evacuate. This material was immediately shipped back to the Soviet Union and was critical in accelerating the Soviet atomic bomb project, cutting years off their development timeline. At the same time, the Americans were executing Operation Paperclip, scrambling to capture German aerospace engineers like Wernher von Braun before the Soviets could get them. The ashes of Berlin were the fertile soil in which the seeds of the Cold War were planted. The alliance between the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union was always a marriage of convenience against a common enemy, and the moment that enemy was destroyed in the bunker, the Iron Curtain began to descend. On the morning of May 2, 1945, the commander of the Berlin defense area, General of the Artillery Helmuth Weidling, realized that his remaining troops had run out of ammunition. There was no strategic reserve, no miracle weapon, and no hope. Weidling drafted a surrender order, which was broadcast from the loudspeakers of Soviet propaganda trucks and a captured German Tiger tank driving through the ruined streets. As the order echoed off the shattered concrete, the guns finally fell silent. It was an eerie, deafening silence that the surviving soldiers and civilians had not experienced in weeks. The cost of this silence was almost beyond human comprehension. The Red Army had suffered over 80,000 dead and nearly 300,000 wounded in just over 2 weeks of fighting. German military casualties are estimated at roughly 100,000 dead, with civilian deaths from artillery, starvation, and the ensuing brutal occupation numbering in the hundreds of thousands. The Battle of Berlin stands as the ultimate testament to the terrifying capacity of the industrialized world to completely annihilate itself. It is a stark reminder that when political fanaticism is backed by the full weight of a mobilized war economy, the end result is always a landscape of ashes and bone. The tactics of the T-30-34, the 88mm gun, and the Panzerfaust are now relics of history, but the geopolitical shockwaves generated in those final 16 days continue to define the borders and the paranoia of our modern world. In the brutal calculus of war, victory is rarely about who is right, but simply about who is left standing in the rubble. Which factor do you believe was the absolute primary reason for the catastrophic casualty rates suffered by the Soviet Red Army during the final assault on Berlin? A. Stalin's politically motivated deadline to take the city by May 1st. B. The inherent tactical advantages of the German defensive positions in a dense urban environment. Or C. The failure of Soviet commanders to properly coordinate infantry and armor in the initial phases of the attack. Drop your answer and your reasoning in the comments below, and let us debate the tactics.